Good evening. Thank you for attending the Songs webinar tonight. My name is Will Hasty. I'm professor of German in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures here at the University of Florida. Over the past nearly 5 years, I've also been occupied with the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, or SONGS initiative, with the help of national and international guest speakers, colleagues from numerous departments and centers here at UF, and the generous support of the Waldo W. Nacurk Fund. If you take a look at the SONGS website, which I hope you do, and take a look at the event and symposium titles over the last 5 years or so, you will have the impression that the critical focus of the SONGS initiative has been on global cultural resources in the broadest or largest possible sense. For example, in terms of border walls that have stemmed the flow or stopped the flow of immigrant populations over large geographical areas, or in terms of firewalls and seawalls, either as manifestations of or as efforts to mitigate the increasingly tangible effects of climate change, again, over large geographical areas. In the present semester, we are doing something a little bit different. With the help of national and international guest speakers again, and with the indispensable help of colleagues in my own Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, as well as UF colleagues in the departments of English and History, we have been experimenting with an inversion of the past SONGS focus on global cultural resources in the large to global cultural resources in the small. The SONGS webinar and symposium series this spring bears the title Global Cultural Resource Analyses, whereby the idea is to scrutinize topics of more modest spatial and temporal dimensions. More modest, of course, is not the same thing as to say that topics of smaller dimensions cannot have a power and resonance equal to that of topics with much larger spatial and temporal dimensions, as we know very well when we think of small things like a virus or the precision of a given martial arts grip, or perhaps the way my cat, who's named Joey, cannot resist testing the center of gravity of vertical objects to see if they tip over. For this inversion, I have taken this dictum from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz as an inspiration. Every single substance in its perfect motion involves the whole universe. We have, I believe, a most interesting global cultural resource to talk about tonight. And without further ado, I would like to turn things over to my Languages, Literatures, and Cultures departmental colleague, Sara Tilly, with my gratitude.
Thank you very much, Will. Today we have someone I personally consider an excellent scholar. I have learned a lot from his scholarship himself. Professor Phil Howell, who is going to talk to us about the history of text, and following that we will have a response to this talk by Professor Terry Harper from the Department of English. I will begin by introducing Professor Phil Howell to our audience. I will also like to have a brief introduction for Professor Howell. After the presentation and the response, we will open the floor for questions and answers. So let me introduce you to Professor Phil Howell. He is the author of numerous books and articles, and one of his most fascinating books is At Home and Astray, the Domestic Dog in Britain, where he explores the transformation of certain attitudes and practices toward dogs and the intense debates that accompany this transformation. He is also professor of historical geography and fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Cambridge. His primary research interests are in animal geographies of gender and sexuality, and colonialism and imperialism. And his most recent research has been involved in the growth and promotion of animal history or animal-human history, themes of which take in the biopolitics of life and death and contemporary society. So his work on pet keeping, the emergence of pet keeping, is really eye-opening, and it is quite fascinating. In response to Professor Howell's talk, Terry Harper will talk to us for about 10 minutes, and Professor Harper is a professor of he specializes in comparative literature and literary theory. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, my own alma mater, actually. And he also is very much interested in animal themes and animals in literature in particular. His books and publications include Explanations, Reading Machines, and The Upgrade Path, published by the University of Minnesota Press. So I will now invite Professor Howell to talk to us, share his presentation with us, and after that we move on to
Thank you very much, Sarah, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm just going to share my screen now, hoping that this will work. That's the desktop. There we go. I've just gone along with whatever PowerPoint has encouraged me to have for design. So these particular slides will do their own thing. So for some reason, if I press that, it'll tell you I come from the University of Cambridge. So it's 11:10 p.m. In the UK at the moment. So I'm sort of keeping myself going with Diet Coke, and the food of the gods that's known as the Jaffa cake is an excellent thing. So it's a pleasure to be speaking to folks in Gainesville or wherever you are in the environs. I was there one time, and I went down to Micanopy and had a good time. So it would be lovely to be there again. My wife is American and would sign up for it straight away were that opportunity there. But it's a pleasure to talk to you from slightly cold England. We had snow at several times today, which is fun. But I get to talk to you for about 40 minutes. I promised Sarah that I'm good on time, so I'm gonna have to sort of stick to that. And I'm here really to tell you a little bit about the history of pets. And then it occurred to me to say, and what we don't know about the history of pets, which is of course just a sort of cunning ruse to cover my own ignorance. But there's a lot that it's a very sort of grandiose that we don't know historically, culturally, and there's a lot of work to be done. So again, in a classic academic move, I will bat this back to people and say, there you go. There's a whole suite of exciting stuff that people can get involved with if that's what they want to do. I'm also very, very interested in literature, and it's a pleasure to have an interdisciplinary crew, if I can use that term. Now, I do have to go through these slides relatively quickly. I was saying to the songs team that I prefer just to try and talk rather than read from a script. If anybody does want the script, I did actually write it out, but I'm very happy to send that on. But I'll just try and talk as conversational as I can about where we are really in terms of animal history and the history of pets. You know, there is a wider question. Why do this sort of stuff? Why look at animals? This is a classic question that John Berger, the art historian and cultural critic, raised 50 years ago. Why look at animals? And there is a tendency, if you take that route, to think that, well, we're not really talking about animals, we're talking about people. John Berger's argument was that in the modern age, we don't really have real animals, certainly not animals that you see on the screen or in books or in zoos. He tends to argue that real animals disappear, and you get sort of simulacra, you get avatars, you get mediated animals. And that's a very important perspective. It's not one I particularly share. And even when you look into the faces of these animals and their owners here in photographs like this, carte de visite, then this is a record of an encounter. Clearly, you're just looking at pixels on a screen, but they are in some way a snapshot from an actual encounter with real people at a real moment in time, and indeed real animals, even if they've got slightly comical top hats on. But when we look at animals in photographs like this, particularly the one with the World War I soldier on the right of the screen, we're tempted, we're clearly looking at a relationship, and there's something very poignant in a young man who's off to war and in that terrible conflict, and this pet who has been marshaled into the photographer's office for this wonderful picture. But there's a sense in which you can date the human being by what he or she, what they're wearing, but the dogs look more or less the same. There's a weird sense, even though we know that breed types change, there's a weird sense in which, okay, it's black and white, but that little terrier or whatever the heck that little dog is, that dog could have been photographed yesterday. You know, there's a sense that that dog speaks to us more directly, but on the other hand, seems to lack a history. And trying to give history back to animals, and certainly to the relationship that has led these dogs to the photographer's studio, is something that historians have been doing for a while now. I've been doing it long enough that when I started doing it, it felt pioneering and sort of exciting and possibly sort of career challenging. It wasn't entirely a respectable thing to do 20 and some years back, but now it's become a very flourishing field. Way back when, and I won't speak too much about the wider project of animal history, but way back when, animal history was first mooted in historical journals as a joke. And there is an article on pets and pet history and why we need pet history, which, when it was published in 1974, pseudonymously, it was a satire, a kind of spoof. It's a sort of, it's a tweaking of the nose of the historical profession for its, according to the author of this article, it's sort of faddish interest in minorities and marginal populations and so on. And the odd thing, of course, is that although this was raised in a kind of mean spirit of satire all those years ago, what was written in the opening paragraph of this spoof is pretty much accepted. Certainly by people like me and in the mainstream historical profession and in interdisciplinary animal studies beyond it. None of this is particularly shocking or outlandish, just as, you know, writing about LGBT people isn't outlandish, writing about marginalized communities isn't outlandish. So there's a sense in which pet history was its time has come, and it's been one of the leading edges of this wider project of historical animal studies or animal history, excuse me. And if people are interested in this, there is a recent project of some historians at the University of Manchester called Pet Histories, which is very good. And Chris Pearson's blog series, Sniffing the Past. I'm not particularly fond of that particular title, but Chris Pearson has written very, very entertainingly in a very a very accessible way about specifically dogs and history, not just pet dogs, but it's a very, very flourishing field, and I've contributed to it in the ways that Sarah has already mentioned. So it's slightly shocking that it's now 7 years ago that that book At Home and Astray came out. But I've edited a couple of recent collections on urban animal history and animal human history beyond that. Excuse me. And what I didn't realize even 7 years ago was that there'd be more books about Victorian dogs. You sort of think, well, that's a niche. You sort of want to claim that for a while, but actually there are plenty of excellent books. Chris Pearson, who I've mentioned already, has a sort of comparative urban history in the 19th century, early 20th century of New York and London and Paris. That came out only a few months ago. Michael Warboys, Julie Marie Strange and Neil Pemberton were kind enough to say that their book, The Invention of the Modern Dog, was a kind of companion piece to my own book, which is very kind of them. But actually, that's a brilliant and splendid book on Victorian Britain and the invention of modern dogs, something that I'll come back to later in this talk. But in literature and humanities, there's also plenty of stuff. Kerry Diana's book, Kerry Diana Chez's book, Victorian Dogs, Victorian Men, which I've had on my shelf forever, well, 3 or 4 years or something. And I decided to get it off my shelf and actually read it in preparation for this talk. Also very, very good, thinking about the ways in which we can think through literature and cultural themes about gender and masculinity in particular. So there's lots out there. Pets are, even if you weren't absolutely convinced by the very, very persuasive message that I've just put out, hardly anyone would disagree that pets are significant. Pets are big business. Pets are, last time I checked, statistically, something like 60% of American households have a pet. 80 million dogs, I think. 90 million cats, 100 million fish. Fish are deeply neglected, but numerically, fish are one of the world's, they are the world's most popular pet, even if they don't necessarily give you quite what cats and dogs that we're familiar with give us. But the pet industry itself in the United States is worth 60-70 billion dollars, something like that, which I checked yesterday is more than Hollywood. So even if you were a little bit skeptical about animal history or pet history, then this is a phenomenon that is worth studying, and it's changing globally all the time. And I hope you will think about the range of pet cultures that are out there. One basic question, though, is, and this this is like an undergraduate essay, although it's not necessarily a bad thing. Get your definitions out there. But also recognizing that the definitions are there and thereabouts. I think James Serpell and Elizabeth Paul's definition that I put up there in the first place is perfectly serviceable. Animals that, non-human animals that human beings keep for primarily emotional purposes, leisure purposes, rather than for their labor or for the particular responsibilities that they might be given. But that's about as good as it gets. A generation ago, more than a generation ago, Keith Thomas, the great British social historian, he suggested that a pet is an animal that is given a name, it's kept in the house, and it's an animal that never gets eaten. And in the decades since that widely quoted definition, virtually all that has gone out the window. Catherine Greer, in a very, very good book on pets in America that I've got on the right of the screen, sums this up very nicely. And, you know, with all the ambiguities, the most important quality pet share is that they've been singled out by human beings. But, and here come all the qualifications, not all pets live indoors. I don't know if any of you are horse people, but, you know, most people don't live in the house with a horse. Large pets may not even live in the same location as their owners, so the stabling might be some distance away. Some pets do not, in fact, have names. If you keep fish, that's a tricky one. Some of them you might have some kind of personal relationship with, but it's unlikely. And a few pets do eventually get eaten in some cultures and societies, which simply reflects the contingent status of the designation. So all this is just to say that that basic question, what is a pet, is extremely difficult to answer, which makes, of course, thinking about the history and the historical geography of pets notably difficult. People have talked, excuse me, people have talked about pet love. You know, this primary emotional relationship that we have with animals. And my historical geography colleague, Heidi Nast, has talked about pet love. And she's talked about pet love being a relatively recent phenomenon. And, you know, if you think about the statistics that I read out a little bit earlier, or talked about a little bit earlier, a lot of that is changing quite fast. And the $60–70 billion spent on the pet industry has doubled in 20 years or something. So, you know, there's a sense of the quickening of this industry and its globalization as well. But all that tends to sort of suggest recent changes. But on the other hand, and this is the difficulty for us when we think historically about pets or companion animals, on the other hand, you can easily think about relationships with animals, emotional relationships, or things which look very like emotional relationships, which go back not hundreds of years, but thousands of years. And I'll come to that as well in a second. So I want to really ask, to begin with, two questions, or pose two questions. The first of which is perfectly straightforward, but the second looks sort of sophistical in all the kind of worst academic ways. So I'll go on to talk, this is a straightforward question, when did animals become pets? But I'm going to pair that a little later on with the version, when did pets become animals? Which, as I say, just sounds like, you know, academic malarkey. But I want to try to defend that. But if we ask this straightforward question, when did animals become pets? Then we can say, look, there's evidence for, or possible evidence for, emotional relationships between human beings and non-human animals, which look to us akin to the kind of thing that Heidi Nast has called pet love. You know, the love that people have for their companion animals. You could, if you wanted to know what is possibly the world's earliest pet, one of the candidates, is not the only one, is something like 14,000 years ago. And in zooarchaeology, the archaeology of animals, or more precisely animal-human relationships, burial of human beings with animals is a common and really significant phenomenon for archaeologists. But what we've got here, and on the right, there's a photo of this burial of a human child, probably a female. In the remains here are from 14,000 years ago in northern Israel, a place called Ainan. And what you see, if I sort of zoom in on it a little bit, what you see is this child being buried with her hand, if it is a her, apparently cradling this small dog, the skeleton of this small dog. It looks like, and in a relatively popular book by Howell, it looks like, if you want to know where pet keeping, how far it goes back, 14,000 years ago. In fact, there's another burial of another female child with a fox, which goes back another 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years, I think, before this. But you could argue it goes back a long way. The problem, though, is that we just don't know. We have the bone assemblage, we have the skeleton assemblage, but we don't know from the assemblage alone what kind of relationship this is. The archaeologist Naomi Sykes said that, as recently noted, the complexity of the human-animal relationship. You can't just read it off. It looks like it, and you know, those of us who are inclined to see this as pet love will see this as pet love. Others will be, especially academics, will be a bit more cautious. And even Hal Herzog, as the final quote suggests, you know, it's tricky. So in terms of prehistory, you could go back thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. But you're probably on safer ground when we're coming to historical records. The BBC History magazine asked me whether I could write a response to a Q&A, to a Q. And the question was, who was the first named pet or domestic animal? This is a historical magazine which is aimed at children and a popular audience. And I immediately said yes. I didn't know the answer, but I'm able to Google just like everyone else. So I Googled it, and apparently the first named companion animal is from the Egyptian 6th dynasty, this animal was a palace dog, a kind of guard dog, palace animal called Abutu, if I'm pronouncing that properly. And you know, you just in the hieroglyphics you have possibilities, but what is inscribed there is that is what I've written here. I'll copy it out. The affection is obvious from effectively the pharaoh talking about the qualities of this particular animal and why he deserved to be memorialized and buried in such a ceremonial way. The BBC History magazine came up with this great graphic, which I love, but again it suggests that you can go back a very, very long way in terms of in terms of these animals. And I had to just check. The 6th dynasty is around about 2280 before the Common Era. So going back thousands of years before the Common Era. So that's more persuasive. And as you sort of roll on the historical evidence, you can get plenty of evidence for the affection that individual owners or their families give to animals. I won't read these kinds of things out, but they come from the Greco-Roman world. A very famous monument now in the Getty Museum in California is the grave stele on the left, and that the Latin is translated as Helena foster child, alumni, incomparable soul. Anima here means soul, not animal, but incomparable and greatly valued soul. So if somebody puts something like that up to their dog, named dog, Helena, you know, a beautiful thing. Who could doubt that these inscriptions, who could doubt that this does not say something about the affection that people have for companion animals, which would take it into the realm of what we think of when we think about pets. There are other examples. Here's Isabella d'Este, who was sort of like the first lady of the Renaissance. And I remember to say that in the American fashion. She's one of the great ladies of the Renaissance, and she staged a funeral for her cat, Martino, if I remember right. But she also gave a funeral to her beloved dog, Aura. And as her secretary put it here, you know, the grief that people feel at the loss of their pets is no more shallow than it is for most human beings, I think, today. This kind of grief is almost universally attested, certainly in this era, particularly with women, and that's something that I'll come to. But it's perfectly easy to see that, you know, we can think about these animals as much loved pets. And I prefer to use the common term pet rather than the academic term companion animal here, for reasons which I can explore in the questions if you wish. So we can think of biophilia or zoophilia. A more recent example is discussed in Ingrid Taig's book on 18th century pets and pet keeping. Lady Isabella Wentworth, I couldn't find a picture of her, I'm afraid, doesn't seem to exist, but she had a monkey, rather confusingly called Pug, if I remember, Fubs, a dog, and Puss, not surprisingly a cat. But she devoted enormous affection to these animals, and what she says about the death of Fubs could be said, it's again perfectly recognizable. Sure of all of its kind, there never was such a one, nor never can be. So many good qualities, so much sense and good nature, and cleanly, and not one fault. But few human creatures had more sense. It's quite a common sort of form of inscription. And those of you who know your Byron, I'm from Nottingham, so this Newstead Abbey is just around the corner for me. But in Lord Byron's family home at Newstead, there is this great grave, which is devoted to, which is a grave for his Newfoundland dog Bosun, who's there on the bottom right. And I won't read all the inscription, but this is the most fulsome praise to an animal that probably ever has been. It's a really impressive monument, and it's regularly cited by people talking about pets in history. It feels a bit like, you know, the comparison between humans and animals in Isabella Wentworth's comments. However, it's not necessarily even written by Byron. It could have been written by a friend of his, but Byron liked it. It might have been written somewhat satirically, with a bit more misanthropy and rather less zoophilia, if I can put it that way. It's rather more of a kind of critique of human vanity than it is a sort of praise of animal virtues. So even here, even when we have inscriptions which seem to say directly, you know, about how wonderful pets are, we need to be a bit careful. I'll move on a little bit. I won't spend time here, but we need to be careful in thinking about pet love just going back through history, so universal that it's barely worth thinking of it as having a history at all. It's just, it goes back hundreds of years, probably thousands in this. It's a 26,000-year-old love story, as the title of, or the subtitle of a recent book by Jackie Collis Harvey has it. Now, I promised the second question though, and I need to speed up a little bit. A more important question for me, which takes us to the kind of more recent history of pets, is to say, when did pets become animals? Which sounds weird, but if we revisit the business of what is a pet, then when we use that word pet, we tend to automatically now think about animals, but a pet is any object that is pampered or to which one is devoted. You can pet a child. A child can be a pet, an indulged favorite. You know, you think about pet names or anyway, lots of other things. You know, it's a relationship. It's not an object. And actually, it's only more recently in the modern age that pet becomes attached to animals, you know, and it's a sort of transition from, or a transference from, petting of favorites to animals, and now it's become a kind of object in its own right. And if we think in that way, if we think not of pets, not even of affection, but of the relationship and how a society thinks about that, that's really important here. And you think of those Greco-Roman, those inscriptions from the classical world, but classical scholars will tell you that Greco-Roman society was not a pet-keeping society. People had pets, but was it a pet-keeping society? No, not in terms of numbers, not in terms of how those animals were regarded by the rest of society, the people who weren't gaga about dogs and cats and so on. Even in the Middle Ages, even in the early modern period, pet keeping was nothing to shout about. And it's only more recently, Keith Thomas says, by 1700, that you could talk about a society being a pet keeping society, you know, obsessive pet keeping. Ingrid Tate talks about this wonderfully, and she makes a real case for the idea that it's the 18th century that pets get invented. And I'm sorry I'm flicking through so quickly, but effectively her argument is that, you know, at the beginning of the 18th century, you could pets are not respectable. Pets are coddled things that unwise and indulgent women treat with this sickly and sentimental and somewhat perverse affection. The idea is that these women who love their lapdogs should be actually devoting their attention more to their husbands and to their children rather than to these pet favorites. So I've written this elsewhere. The pet sort of arrives in the modern world more as a kind of monstrosity, not as something, you know, wonderful that everyone loves, more as kind of monstrosity. And it's only nearer the end of the 18th century and then into the early 19th century, nearer to the Victorian age, then you get pets becoming the sort of icon of family life, famously from Victoria and Albert, pictured here in the 1840s, the early years of their marriage. And there's a sense in which all is right with the world, as long as you don't look too closely at the dead ducks and birds which have just been hunted. But all seems right in the marriage, all seems right in the kingdom, with the first family having these pets as a part of their household. We can't underestimate just how influential that was. All of this is preliminary to arguing that, in fact, it wasn't the 18th century, and I'm a professional Victorianist, so, you know, naturally, I'm just going to say that everything changes. That's the most important period ever. But there is a case to be made that it's the Victorian age that really sets the seal on this business of pet keeping. There's a wonderful book by John Homans, a book, you know, written for a general audience, you know, that's not necessarily heavy on critical theory or anything, but does a wonderful job of writing about our relationship with dogs. And John Homans argues that it's Victorian times. That's when the dog as we know it was invented. Kerry Diana Cruz, I just read this today and I liked it, that she's noted that our pet culture is in some sense weirdly, obtusely Victorian. You know, that we have changed in all sorts of ways, but in some sense our Western, modern Western, contemporary Western pet culture is really created in the Victorian age. And as I say, I'm sort of party pre, but I agree completely with that. Michael Warboys, Steve Neil Pemberton, Julie Marie Strange. What I love about this is that they identify it completely with, or they with complete precision. They say that the first modern dog is 1865, not 1864, not 1866. And the first modern dog is the animal there, a pointer called Major. And their argument is that this is when breed standards for dogs, the kind of judging that you see all the time at Crufts or the Westminster Dog Show or whatever, this is the first time that these things come together. And the dog as we know it, the modern dog, this is the very first, 1865. I'm going to disagree slightly, but in kind of in this game of trying to sort of date with precision exactly when things happen, I'm going to say sometime between June 1859 and December 1860. That's when modern pets, modern dogs, pet keeping, this is when it really begins. And the kind of things that I'm thinking about here are June 1859 is supposedly the world's first true dog show. In Newcastle, probably Birmingham in 1860 is a better bet for this. And to be honest, dogs were shown before that, but never mind. There's a sense in which dog shows were invented in this period, the 1860s. You get the first true pet food, Spratt's Patent X dog biscuit, which is invented round about sort of 1860, thereabouts. And you also get the founding of the world's first animal shelter, what is now known as the Battersea Cats and Dogs Home. When it was founded, it was called the Home for Lost and Starving Dogs. And I don't have time to talk about this here, but there's something really, really important in the fact that dogs, the destiny of the dog is seen to be in the home, not on the streets. And that has enormous implications, but the dog is sort of welcomed into the home, but street dogs are policed out of existence. Most countries of the world have street dogs, but it is a weird thing for us, for you in the US, for us in the UK, in a few other countries, that free roaming dogs are to us a kind of an anomaly. You know, they look as if they're suffering. They look as if something should be done about it. And basically the compact in the Victorian age is to save a few, but actually to kill the rest, to euthanize animals because they shouldn't be in the public realm. That's something I can talk to, but I talked a lot in the book that Sarah mentioned, At Home and Astray. Now, I'm actually keeping quite well to time. What we don't know about pet history, I hope that you can already be guessing some of this. This is just some of what we don't know about pet history. Here's just a few things slightly randomly. I've talked about this in a slightly obscure article in a bit more depth, but just to fire off some questions, you know, what about the more than half of the world's population that don't keep pets? It's always weird to people that I don't have a pet, I don't have a dog, and you know, most people who write about pets are pet lovers. I'm a pet lover, but I don't have a pet. But what about the history of people who don't like dogs, like pets, don't approve of them? Still a major theme, particularly I think directed at women, but that's, you know, that's another issue. What about pet history? I think I put here beyond the usual suspects, beyond cats and dogs. What about fish? Birds are having a real moment. There are several recent publications on birds. But, you know, what about exotic animals, or at least, or exotic pets, at least pets exotic to most of us in the West? No, I'm thinking Tiger King and all that sort of stuff. You know, what about the, there's a whole range of animals that actually haven't really attracted historians or historical attention. The biggest thing is pets in non-Western cultures. You know, we are so far from having a global history of pets. We're nowhere near that. And it's, I say this with much embarrassment. I have written a little bit about a tiny part of the world perched on the edge of the continent of Europe, which is influential in some important ways, but it's a very, very small part of the world. And just seeing some of your surnames, you know, on the Zoom link, there are lots of parts of the world which, anyway, things have been written, but it hasn't really been stitched together in a terribly convincing way. And I think sort of lathering everything, all that difference in an argument that everyone loves pets just isn't really going to work. We know something about how a particular culture of pet keeping, which most of us think of as pretty normal, but how that culture of pet keeping has spread and been disseminated at different times, particularly in the 19th, 20th centuries, to other parts of the world. That is something that we know something of, but not nearly enough. And what is the future of pets? I was asked by some market survey company to give my thoughts on the future of pets, which I did really badly. I gleaned that the people paying for this survey were a major pet food company, but that's all I know. But what's the future of pets, especially in a world of environmental crisis and environmental constraints? Another really, really big question that historians can give some attention to, but actually we probably need a much bigger interdisciplinary field to try to answer those kinds of questions. Sarah, I've gone on about 2 minutes, I think, but I'll stop there if that's okay.
That has been wonderful. Thank you very, very much for a wonderful talk. We will now move to Terry Harple's response to this talk.
Thank you, Sarah. Phil, can we close out your
Yep. I'm just trying to
slide there?
Oh, sorry, I need to wait from it. Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, there we go. Thank you. There we go. Probably have to stop sharing the screen, I think, for a moment.
Stop share. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you, Phil, very much. I really do want to thank my UF colleagues, Will Hastie and Sarah Thilly, for inviting my participation in this fascinating discussion tonight. And again, to Phil for giving me the opportunity to read and reflect on his work and to think a bit about it in terms of not only the application to some of my own work, but how I live my life as someone who lives with animals that we call pets. Maybe I'll talk about that later. So Phil, I want to begin by thanking you for reminding us that pet keeping only appears both typical and commonplace in the modern world, and key in some way as a marker for good and generous humanity, because we tend to ignore the reality that in many cultures they did not and do not treat intimate companionability between humans and other animal species as we are commonly taught in the West, in the modern industrial West. We don't know enough about a global history of human, non-human interactions to be sure that the very concept of pet keeping as a defining and progressive trait of humans, or really related to this as a reliable index of affluential humans, such as our faith in the correlation of progress with economics, we can't be sure that these ideas are not shaped if not the very products of economic and social mechanisms of industrial production and globalization that have in some effect given us economic necessity in the shape of affective inclination and moral progress. And what I want to sketch tonight, perhaps a slightly darker story than the one you've told us thus far, but the terrible material truth of the biopolitics of our keeping of pets in the late Anthropocene, which falls within the long shadow of modern humanity's agonistic relations to most non-human animal species. And the reality of this is actually invisible to most of us because it's so firmly integrated into already existing human relations to non-pet animals that we're disinclined to notice how it affects our relation to pets. Now, what I really want to do in a sense is add a disquieting coda to Hal Herzog's famous observation in the title of his 2010 book that you mentioned on the paradoxes and contradictions of our relations with other animal species. You may remember, to the audience here, the book was called Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat. And he leaves out in that title a puzzle that I think is just as vexing as the others. In addition to loving, hating, and eating, there are some we feed to those we love. So, Phil, you've shown in Home and Astray and elsewhere that many of our present notions of what a pet is and what are effective relations with pets as an icon of family life, as you said, should be, they appear to have been mostly invented in the 19th century within a particular social, economic, technological moment in the West. The invention of the dog as family pet in a modern sense, and I want to pick up on something you talked about briefly, is also the time of the invention of new conditions for our caring for the dog. And among these was the time of the invention of dog food. Now, I mean to echo here something that the French cultural theorist Paul Virilio has said rather trenchantly, that the invention of the ship entailed the innovation of the shipwreck, the invention of the locomotive, the innovation of the rail disaster, and the airplane, the innovation of the airplane crash. So just so, the invention of the pet was the invention of pet food as a dedicated channel of industrial production and of new and terrible forms of catastrophe. Now, I have no time here to detail the many technological revolutions in pet food production since James Spratt's first dog biscuits, and how it is that specifically prepared pet foods came to take a place of privilege as ostensibly the most convenient and the healthiest methods for nourishing our companions, or of all the alignments of that industry with other quickening methods of control and disposition of non-human animals in the 19th and the 20th and now the 21st centuries. Because basically from its inception, the whole of the pet industry and its subsidiary pet food sectors have been intimately bound to the economic and technological imperatives of modern animal agriculture. And there is a deeply troubling feedback loop, or at least I find it deeply troubling, between pet love and more general systems of animal production and consumption. And these have the most profound consequences. So just a couple of some data to try to make sense of this. The American Pet Foods Product Association estimates that as of 2021, the American Pet Products Association, excuse me, as of 2021, 45 million households in the US include at least one cat. 69 million households include at least one dog. There are another 40 million households devoted that have at least one bird, one horse, one fresh or saltwater fish, reptile or small mammal. But I'm going to focus largely on cats and dogs, for which there seems to be the best data, though this is very messy, and some of what I'm going to say tonight is very approximate because it's hard to tease out the data. But mostly because cats and dogs are, for most of us, the largest pet animals to whom we feed other animals. Cats are obligate carnivores. They cannot thrive without meat in their diet. Dogs are facultative carnivores, meaning that they do not, strictly speaking, need to eat other animals so long as there's an appropriate balancing of necessary nutrients in their food. And there's been a revolution in pet food for dogs recently in which all plant-based dog foods with very good results for growth and flourishing have been possible. So I want to give you some back of the envelope figures, leaving aside cat and dog companions who are fed an all-meat diet and dogs who are fed a mostly plant-centered diet. Just some numbers to sort of ring this out. So a cat of typical healthy weight, a domestic cat, house cat, of typical healthy weight is about 10 pounds, requires about 220 kilocalories per day. Good quality commercial cat foods get about 85% of their calories from animal sources. So, in other words, a cat consumes about 187 kilocalories from animal sources each day. A dog, and I'm going to just focus on the most popular breed in the US since about 1991, a neutered Labrador retriever male, about 70 pounds. He needs about 1,300 kilocalories a day, and good quality commercial dog foods get about 50% of their calories from animal sources. So a dog consumes about 650 kilocalories from animal sources each day. And of course, larger dogs may consume more, smaller dogs less. A lot of this depends upon the level of activity and so on. But it's important that we translate this into other impacts. And some of the obvious ones are climate impacts. And I want to again keep in mind that all these numbers are complicated by the commingling of multiple mammal and avian proteins and fats in pet food and by some of the chemistry of animal rendering. But here we go. A kilo of beef is about 5,000 kilocalories. In other words, 7.7 days of animal source calories for a dog. To produce it requires 15,000 liters of water, and it generates 27 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. A kilo of lamb, 7,800 kilocalories, 35.5 days of animal source calories for a cat, requires about 10,000 liters of water to produce the 1 kilogram. 1 month cat food, 1 kilogram of food, 10,000 liters of water, and generates about 39 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. Kilogram of pork, 3,000 kilocalories, 2.3 days of animal source calories for a dog, 6,000 liters of water. You feed your dog for not even 3 days, 6,000 liters of water were consumed to produce that. Generates about 12 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. Finally, a kilogram of chicken, 1,000 calories, 4.5 days of animal sourced calories for the cat, about 4,300 liters of water, and about 7 kilos of CO2 equivalents. So you can run the numbers. In the US, there are about 95 million pet cats and 90 million pet dogs. A notionally omnivore, human-led household of 2 adults, 1 man and 1 woman, plus 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl, both of about 10 years of age. And of course, I'm not prescribing any model of the family here. I'm just trying to balance the metabolic differences with regard to age and gender. That family of 4 humans consumes at least 8,300 calories a day, if they are not exceptionally physically active and their body weights are within normal ranges. The percent of calories from a typical omnivore family's diet is about the percentage of calories from animal sources for a typically omnivore family of humans is about 30%. So in other words, 2,550 kilocalories for the entire family comes from animal sources. Okay, that's a lot of numbers. I'm sorry to throw them at you. Here's how this works. All pet cats in the US consume daily as many kilocalories from animal sources as about 8 million 4-human omnivore households. All pet dogs in the US consume daily as many kilocalories from animal sources as 23 million 4-human omnivore households. Those are not inconsequential numbers. The 2020 US census tallied only 72 million households with an average of 1.8 children. So in terms of their environmental footprint from the food that we all eat, the meat-centered diets of our most numerous non-human companions in the home amount to almost another half household across the entire United States. Now, these numbers have, of course, ethical significance because of their impacts on the climate, right? The land animals that we raise and kill to feed our pets represent a very significant portion of the total number of land animals raised and killed for human and non-human food. And I'm leaving marine animals completely out of these calculations because, in fact, we don't have any real clear idea on how many are killed as bycatch in industrial fishing. And by some estimates, there may be a trillion marine animals killed as bycatch from commercial fishing. But okay, animal agriculture, we're talking about land animals, is one of the primary contributors of human activity to the production of greenhouse gases, deforestation, biodiversity collapse, water scarcity, and air and water pollution. The carbon footprint of animal agriculture overall is larger than that of the entire human transportation sector. And by some credible estimates, it represents the largest contribution of our species to anthropogenic global warming. Now, when we start talking about the role that pet food plays in all this, we need to consider there are notional efficiencies. Most of the animal flesh, bone, and feather fed to our cats and dogs is not in the form of whole animals, but as meal or byproducts derived from agriculture, including so-called 4D animals, a distasteful term used in the industry that means dead, diseased, disabled, or dying prior to slaughter. Goats, pigs, horses, rats, roadkill, animals euthanized at shelters, restaurant and supermarket refuse, all of that is rendered by modern industrial techniques. The animal rendering industry in the United States is huge. It's all rendered into uniform lipids and proteins that are then turned in to food. The rendering industry will happily tell you that they are the original recyclers, and that their transformation of these byproducts into safe and nutritious pet food, as well as food, ironically, for the very animals that we then feed to our pets in the next go round, represents a substantial benefit to the environment. Now, look, assuming that we must do something with all the protein, fat, and bone residues generated by the 70 billion land animals killed annually for these purposes, that's a worldwide number, something other than, of course, find ways to reduce that count, then yes, the rendering of those materials into something with use and commercial value, in that sense, rendering unused animals into food for animals, is an environmentally responsible strategy, but only if we can imagine that there's no other solution, no other way out of that system. And, basically, my point here is, along with all the uncertainties about the history and the future of pet keeping, is that we don't fully grasp the Ptolemaic involutions of the feedback cycles that are at work here, or the true extent to which animals we kill to feed the animals that we choose not to kill contribute to the expansion of numbers of both kinds of animals, and thus prolong a monstrous confidence game that we are all destined to lose in the long run. My sense is, and I've not, I think this would require a great deal more investigation than has been done to date, as far as I can tell. My sense is that the profligate appetites of humans for animal flesh has surely been tracked closely by the inventive repurposing of so-called useless proteins and fats into useful but desubjectified, anonymized matter for pet foods, which we then feed to our beloved companions because we are told that we must, or we believe that good food, perversely animal food, is in every sense a true token of our love, when in fact we may be helping to a considerable extent to prolong a cycle of the cruelest predation, and thus the production of yet more accursed remains, which must then be recaptured back into the cycles for profit and for the benefit of the animals that we care for. Now, I don't think I need to describe to you the real conditions of the food animals that are captured in this cycle in monstrous factory farms and CAFOs, the concentrated animal field feeding operations, which terrors and depravity we must not ignore. But according to an analysis by the Sentience Institute, 99% of animals used for food in the US are raised in CAFOs. And I can only assume that that number must be proportionally as higher for animals whose broken and divided bodies are destined for Spot and Fluff's dinner bowls. Because Spot and Fluff have no idea where their next meal comes from, only that we must love them very much to have magically produced it for them twice a day. But we can only pretend to participate in their blessed ignorance. The more that there are animals consumed by the planet's primary predator species, the more will there be unwanted, accursed animal byproducts that we must do something with. And because the manufacture of those products can be made profitable, this will decrease the economic costs of animal agriculture. The infrastructure for doing this and our acceptance of it grows as a consequence, and both are made to seem natural, even inevitable, by our determined, generous affection for our companions and our own distinct but interlaced in some ways willful blindness to the catastrophic effects of our own undisciplined consumption of other animal species. I'll end with this observation. In 2009, New Zealand architects and ecologists Robert and Brenda Vail published a book evaluating the relative environmental impacts of small and large decisions that we make every day. The book's memorable title posed the question, is it time to eat the dog? This is and is not a serious proposal. As they show in the book, the environmental costs of feeding Spot, as we have been feeding him, are far more destructive than many other options we have for passing our time amicably with non-humans. They recommend a hamster as a more ecologically responsible choice. But the question they ask rings darkly funny only because it assumes that we too might be ready to make an ecologically responsible choice, but as fellow meat eaters. and there are other paths forward. How do we handle the ghastly cruelty of the willful blindness and contingencies that make this cycle seem infinitely repeatable when it is clearly not? How will they be handled in the future of pets? Are then the complexities, inconsistencies, and contradictions of pet love yet another variation of our troubled, hubristic relation to other animal species, whether we love them with cuddles and treats or forks and knives? I don't think it's time yet to eat the dog, but I think it's time to start feeding him something else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek, for this very thought-provoking response. Well, I guess like there's so much food for thought. I don't know if Phil would like to say something in reaction to Terry's response before we open the floor for Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of things there. I lecture on a course called Political Appetites, Geographies of Food and Power, and I give lectures on meat eating. And you know, the history and up to the environmental impact of meat eating. So I'm very aware of the ecological hoofprint, to use the title of Tony Weiss's book, and the issue of rendering. Terry, you'll know this. People like Nicole Shukin have done a great job in sort of connecting the actualities of the dismantling of animal bodies and the sort of cultural representation. So all that's absolutely right. Most of this work goes, as you've already indicated, you know, under the sign of biopolitics and zoopolitics, and think about how we can use that theoretical perspective to illuminate things like animal agriculture and all of these things. What I do in terms of pet dogs, I don't know whether you can still see that. No, you can't. But that slide that I ended with, I used that once because I talked about animal shelters and kill shelters, and it was a little bit grim. So the dark side of pet keeping and its biopolitics is absolutely not something that I avoid. There's a kind of critical history of pet keeping which aligns with critical animal studies, for instance. So, you know, to move away just slightly from animal agriculture, you know, the thing that we have created, the thing with Battersea Dogs Home is the world's first kill shelter. So, you know, I've talked about this in my book, but we know this today, that shelters today, one in three dogs in America that go into shelters never come out, which actually is not a bad, you know, as in the history of kill shelters, that's not too bad. 2 out of every 5 cats that end up in animal shelters will be euthanized, and there's the nearness of life and death. You know, this is biopolitics, but it's also necropolitics. Everyone who writes about this knows just how sort of closely suited those things are together. But there are even more apart from the ecological side of things. The issue of predation, which you mentioned, Terry. The cats kill wild birds, clearly, and that is a major issue in lots of countries. And you know, the sort of trophic knock-ons of what did you call cats? Fluff. Weirdly, I had a cat once called Fluffy, but that's the only pet I've ever had. But you know, there was a complex cultural and biopolitics about keeping pets. To go back, I don't want to monopolize this at all, but to go back to Time to Eat the Dog, what the problem I had with that, you know, the numbers are staggering and they're absolutely right, but they went with that for their title, because it's a catchy thing. But it's not, they didn't go with time to have a staycation, or time to finish your plate, or time not to have another pizza meal, or time to think twice about having a child. I mean, this is really difficult. But the most a human being, bringing a human being into the world is a major ecological decision. I can slightly, this isn't a way of dodging this, but I don't eat meat. I don't have a pet. I don't have children. But these are massively linked, really, really important questions. And as you say, Terry, the biopolitics, the statistics are part of this, how you count, but the numbers are staggering, and they are, and quite rightly should be impossible to ignore. But you're quite right that what I've slightly skated over, 1860 Spratz paid eggs, by an American manufacturer, I think, who saw stray dogs eating biscuits in the Liverpool docks, and saw a kind of gap in the market very presciently. But that is absolutely entangled with what happens in Chicago, especially what happens in stockyards and slaughterhouses all around the world. So absolutely, couldn't agree more.
Okay, thank you very much. We still have about around like 10 minutes for Q&A. So anyone who has a question or comment, please feel free to speak. Okay, I don't see the hands, but I see that two. All right, Samantha, go ahead. Yes.
I have so many thoughts, and I wish we had so much more time to discuss. But one of the things, can people hear me, by the way? Okay,
Yes.
great. When you're talking about Terry, when you brought up the book, Is It Time to Eat the Dog? I wasn't familiar with this book, but I was also struck by what a cultural tunnel vision that is there are cultures that eat dogs as part of their common diet. So and while there is a justification in that, many of the cultures that do not commonly eat dogs are more culpable for the ecological crises we're facing, it still struck me, going to what Professor Howell was saying about that we don't have a global comprehensive history of pet keeping. And I think that there's some sense that pets are a very Western idea, even though that I have to imagine is not true. I've not done research on this myself, but I have to imagine is not true. And so I was mostly curious about the sort of idea of the other cultural encounters, especially with white imperialism and colonization and invasion, of valuing different societies based on what animals they eat. And I think this sort of tracks back to who is it, Rousseau, who had all his ideas about like what's the proper foods to eat. And I think about this kind of relevantly with the recent pandemic, right? Is that it was traced there's a common belief is it was traced back to markets in China where they were selling, weird foods to the West, to the American mindset, at least, that's my context. So that was just some of the thoughts that I was having, and the complicated interplay between what is food and what is not food and what is pet, and how that plays into cultural encounters, particularly between like Western white imperialism and other cultures and societies.
I'd like to maybe say something in response to that, because I do want to accede to the notion that the that the Vales book is problematic in so many ways. As you said, sort of a cultural kind of tunnel vision, and Phil's pointed out exactly that they wanted to hook their reader. That's why I picked up the book the first time when I first saw it. They wanted to hook their reader with something that would be shocking to a Western reader, to a pet-loving, dog-loving reader. And so it was kind of a cheap trick for me to use it in my comments. But I do think that it has some resonance in the sense that the choices that need to be made have to be difficult choices. They are choices that will require a commitment of changes to how we eat, how we dress ourselves, how we carry our bodies through space. So there's that. But I think that, and I will accede to that completely and recognize that it's the case. And Phil's right to say this. This is a taboo subject. When I bring this up in my classes on ecological resilience, that kind of hush falls over the room when I point out that probably the most environmentally consequential choice you can make is not to make a baby, a human baby. There are plenty of babies that want your love already out there. So you can, there are ways to make families without making babies, but okay, that's a separate issue. But I do think that what I was trying to get at with my comment, my response, as very, partial as it was for many Western pet owners, the invisibility of this carbon hoof print and the perverse way in which the culture joins together, entangles in ways that are unreflecting of a regime, of a predatory regime that is environmentally destructive and also untenable by any ethical measure, with the expression of their love, for their companion animal. And that we are seldom, unless we do reflect on it, we seldom reflect on it. And that is one of the ambiguities and the moral challenges of thinking rigorously about our relationship to non-human animals in the domestic sphere. It's easy for most people to do that in the West, because most people in the West, in fact, also consume animals. And so therefore they don't see that there is necessarily a different kind of footprint or a different kind of possibility for their animals. And indeed they tend, for large mammals, most Westerners tend to fetishize the value of animal food for their companion animals as though it is the truest expression of the lives, the natural lives of their pets, when nothing is farther from the case.
Thank you, Terry. We have at least like 2 more questions, and let's not forget that it's past midnight. It's like midnight and a half. So Alvaro.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you, Phil, for the talk. It was very interesting. I have 2 questions. One is, I associate the terminology of companion animals with, the language of animal studies, perhaps animal rights. So I'm curious as to your choice of, the term pet. And the question, I guess, related to that is, when does the pet become a companion animal? The second question that I have is more about, what you're speaking in the, I don't know if I'm remembering the dates wrong, but like mid-19th century, when the modern dog really kind of emerges as we know it. And, it made me think of the early 19th century, the 1820s, with the rise of the first animal rights organization, SPCA, in London. And, is there a way, to what extent are those parts of the same processes about thinking about animals? This rise of animal rights in earlier 19th century, and then this kind of new idea of pets. And are they in any way related? Or does the rise of animal rights as a public discourse shapes the ways in which we then go on to think about pets as this kind of newer concept? Yes. Thank you.
Sarah, shall I take Will's question too? Just
Okay, let's do that. Will, go ahead, please.
So thank you for staying up so late. First of all, Professor Howell. The thing that I want to ask, and this may seem very innocent and naive, and I'm so fully appreciative of the points that Terry has made. And I've listened with attentiveness also to the things that you have had to say about the role that pets have played since well, going back millennia. And what the thing that's occurring to me is companionship. That there's something there. There's something. It seems to be that there's something real. There's something tangible. There's something meaningful to people. And it's difficult, of course, it's always difficult kind of to evaluate that in numbers. Part of me hears the numbers, and part of me understands the numbers, and part of me sees people whose lives are more fulfilled because of the pets that they have in their lives. And it's sort of like when I hear the positions articulated tonight, and I very much enjoyed this sort of overview of animal history and sort of the costs of it. I'm wondering, I'm thinking about Joey, my cat, and I realize I will have that affection, and that he plays a role in our lives as empty nesters, so to speak, and I realize the degree to which that coincides with a sort of economic design. I mean, it's like I understand who's benefiting from this, but at the same time, I, from within, really do have this connection that is meaningful to me. And so this is a question probably for which there is no answer. Although if you have one, I'd be happy to hear it. But that's kind of my question. Just kind of being in this in-between space where I understand the value of this companionship with animals that have been, I know very well, tailored to be companions. But it works, and somehow it does feel like a relationship to others that are meaningful to us, significant others, so to speak. So I'll just stop there and let you respond.
Thank you very much, Will, and to everyone else. It's a pleasure to. It's not a chore staying up at all to listen to and to respond to questions. I'll kind of group them a little bit. I think maybe Alvaro, you asked me why pets, why not companion animals. I did have a little bit in a slide there where you could talk about companion animals, you could talk about personal animals, you could talk about companion species, and you're absolutely right. This tends to be the language of critical animal studies, and the advantage is that you avoid the cultural and historical specificity. But the disadvantage is that you avoid the cultural and historical specificity. Pets mean different things in different places, and we absolutely shouldn't, to come back to Samantha's point, we shouldn't just assume this to be universal. Even the terms that we use, household, family, property is such a key element. These will range massively from place to place and from time to time. That's why the history is important. And I think Haraway, she prefers companion species as a kind of as an advance on the idea of just companion animals. There's something institutional, a kind of cultural regime in that, and I think that's absolutely significant. And it's not just from time to time or from place to place. Within complex societies, then pet keeping will be an element of inter-community arguments and tensions and conflicts, dangerous crossings, as Claire Jean Kim puts it, and that comes to what people eat and where and when and why and in what volume, and food is food is something that brings people together, but it's also something that absolutely divides. And what I would say here, I didn't have time enough, is that women tend to, I have a special focus in the 19th century on women, and that women tend to get targeted for being sentimental, for pampering their pets, including feeding them. I've written about pets in the First World War in Britain, and the Daily Mail, or the Daily Hate as it's called over here, you know, is a sort of very right-wing popular newspaper. And it's something of a comfort to me to know that it was always as objectionable as it is now. It was objectionable in the First World War, and they ran a thing when there was rationing. Sorry, there wasn't rationing, but food was scarce. They ran a whole campaign about, you know, women pampering their pets and feeding them food which could keep babies alive. You know, it's the same kind of divide and conquer, you know, but women were targeted in the 18th century, and they're targeted in the 19th and the 20th and in the 21st for somehow being the repository of all that's wrong with our kinds of pet keeping. Now you can talk about other communities as well, and there is a clear need for an intersectional approach to pet keeping, which it's here already, but I think historically, you know, I think animal history needs to catch up with critical animal studies in that regard. Alvaro, I think you asked about animal welfare too, and that's part of that movement. You know, the class elements of this are very obvious, as well as the sort of gender cultures. And Samantha, you know, this is absolutely, this is exported in colonial cultures and colonial regimes to, of course, to draw distinctions between cultures which are better or more progressive or more civilized, and cultures and communities which aren't, in all the terrible ways in which that can take place. To come back to things that Will and Terry, you know, you were talking about, I think we have to, you know, I'm going to sort of sit on the fence slightly, but I don't have a pet, but I love my American family's pets, and you know, I have learned to love pets, pet dogs especially, in ways that I learned it from them, and I learned it from their great affection and love for their animals. And that, you know, if I'm calling it pet love, I don't mean to sort of reduce this to something sociologically or culturally easy to describe. It's there in the grief that people have when pets die. And I'm the last person in the world to sort of dismiss that or not recognize that as something interesting and significant. And it's the same for, you know, the choices that people make. What I say to my students is that we would all fail a moral audit, an ethical audit. You know, some of us more dramatically than others, for sure. And I have a kind of mini SUV sitting in the drive. I don't do many miles in it, but it's still, it's an SUV. You know, I fly to the States, and that in itself will brush out, you know, the slightly better or more positive elements in my own choices. So when I do this course on food and meat eating with a colleague, I raise it, but I very much don't want our small group teaching supervisions to be about to look around the room and think, who's the least bad here? And when it comes to questions about what is misleadingly called ritual slaughter or whatever, you know, it's the last, pedagogically and ethically and morally, it's the last thing I want to do, to focus on the things that we all do or individuals do, and to in that setting hold them account for it. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't as a society think very, very hard about what we do. But if people love their pets, I walk down the street, and borrowing David Grimm's title, I tend to think of every dog that I see as a citizen canine, you know, and I think of them as fellow citizens who have a right to existence in some way. And I don't scowl if people have baby strollers with, you know, more than one baby in them or something. Good for them. There are all sorts of really, really difficult questions here, but we come to our own accommodation, and that might not be enough. But yeah, you know, it's strange. I usually get asked, why don't you have a dog? My line on this, I'm not trying to make light of this at all, is that I've only written 2 books, 2 monographs, Sarah. One's on sex workers and one's on dogs. And I said to an audience, I don't have a dog. You know, I can write about these things academically. It doesn't mean that I don't have, you know, my own, it doesn't come from a conviction that it's not coming from pet love, but I love pets. Absolutely, I do. And, you know, I don't know if you're being Zoom bombed by pets at the moment, great. You know, pets, companion animals, call them what you will, give us an incredible amount. Whether that's right biopolitically is a separate question. Whether it's right in terms of, you know, the predation that cats do to wild birds, something that I've talked about. Predation is, you know, I know, Terry, you're using this in a very pointed way, but predation is a complex concept, you know, and it may well be that human beings are the greatest predators, but predation tends to get used where what is natural and what is normal is sort of constructed within particular political discourses. Sorry, I'm going on a bit, but I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think, Will, I think you're right. You know, my Facebook feed or whatever, I know younger people, you don't know what Facebook is, but, you know, gets full of the dodo stuff. And I respond to it like lots of other people do, and I realize that's platform capitalism, but it makes me smile, and it gets me through the day a little bit. But in the background of everything is the looming environmental crisis that it's not exactly looming, it's surrounding us all the time, that Terry talks about. So but that is, you know, if you're from, if you've got kids, you know, I'm not trying to claim any priority. It's just it didn't happen for us, and you know, that's one of those things. Not having pets isn't a particular choice, or maybe I'm just too lazy or something. But actually, I love taking my in-laws' dogs for a walk, and being a responsible pet owner, picking up after them, and all the rest. But anyway, sorry, that's there is a slight obligation to personalize these things, but that's my take on it. Sarah, I could stay here forever. Well, not forever, but you know,
thank you.
I realize lots of people have plenty of
Right.
places to go and, you know, walk the dog and all the rest of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there is one perhaps more question, we can take it, but I realize like it's getting close to 1 a.m. your time. So like, I really appreciate your generosity with, you know, like staying with us and your time, etc. And it has been a fascinating event, you know, like it's like it made me think of a million things. I have questions myself, but I'm not going to ask them. I will email them later to you. Yeah.
All right, and I'm glad to see that Jaffa cakes are getting some love. I'm not sure about the industrial production, but amongst the few things that British food doesn't have the highest reputation, but Jaffa cakes are a goodie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much.
Thank you
And-
very
and,
much.
It's been an honor.
Thank you so much.
Terry, thank you so much. Samantha,
Thank
everyone, Amparo, Will. And yes, enjoy the rest of your evenings for those who are still staying a little bit. And good night to you, Phil. Thank you very much again.
All right. Good night to Florida.
Bye
Thanks,
bye.
Sarah.
Bye bye.